generosity usually costs a few dollars. For Clara, a simple bowl of soup bought her a one-way ticket into the bloodiest underworld in Philadelphia. She thought she was just feeding a freezing, homeless man with dementia. She had no idea she had just saved the father of a ruthless mafia kingpin. The neon sign of the South Street diner buzzed with a rhythmic, dying hum, casting harsh pink shadows across the rain-slicked pavement of South Philadelphia. It was 2:15 a.m. on a brutal Tuesday in November. Clara Hastings wiped down the sticky formica surface of counter 3, the harsh smell of industrial bleach barely masking the lingering odor of stale fryer grease and burnt coffee. Her feet ached in her cheap, worn-out Reebok sneakers, and the dull throb behind her temples was a constant reminder of her impending tuition deadline at Temple University's nursing program. The diner was mostly empty, save for a long-haul trucker nursing a black coffee and 2 college kids trying to sober up over a plate of disco fries. The heavy glass door chimed, admitting a violent gust of freezing wind and a figure that immediately drew the ire of Gary, the night manager. He was an elderly man, soaked to the bone. He wore a sodden tweed overcoat that looked like it had been dragged through the muddy gutters of Broad Street. He had no umbrella, no hat, and his thin, white hair was plastered to his skull. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention. They were pale, clouded with profound confusion, darting around the diner like a frightened child lost in a department store. He shivered violently, his frail arms wrapped around his torso. "Hey, no loitering, pal. You gotta buy something, or you gotta get out," Gary barked from the cash register, not even looking up from his phone. "This ain't a homeless shelter." The old man flinched, taking a hesitant step backward toward the storm. He patted his pockets frantically, muttering in rapid, panicked Italian. Clara didn't speak the language, but the universal tone of distress was unmistakable. "Gary, come on, look at him. He's freezing," Clara said, throwing her damp rag into the sink. "I don't care if he's turning into an icicle, Clara. Corporate says no vagrants. If I let him stay, the place fills up with them by 3 a.m. Out." The old man's shoulders slumped. He turned, pushing his trembling hand against the glass door to step back into the freezing downpour. "Wait!" Clara called out, her voice cutting through the diner's low hum. She walked out from behind the counter, gently placing a hand on the man's soaked sleeve. "He's with me. I'm paying for his meal," Gary sneered. "Suit yourself. But it's coming out of your tips." "I'm ringing it up right now." Clara guided the shivering man to a booth in the back, away from the drafty windows. Up close, the contradictions in his appearance were striking. Yes, his coat was ruined, and he smelled of wet wool and city smog. But underneath the tweed, he wore a silk shirt that, while rumpled, looked expensive. More bizarrely, his fingernails were impeccably clean and professionally manicured, and on his left wrist sat a heavy gold watch that looked remarkably like a vintage Rolex President, though Clara assumed it was a cheap knockoff from a street vendor. "Let's get you warmed up," Clara said softly, handing him a stack of paper napkins to dry his face. She hurried to the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup, a basket of warm rolls, and a mug of decaf coffee. The man stared at the food as if it were a mirage. He picked up the spoon with trembling hands and began to eat ravenously. Clara sat across from him, taking a moment to rest her aching legs. "I'm Clara," she said gently, passing him a packet of salt. "What's your name?" He paused, a spoonful of broth halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, his cloudy eyes focusing for a brief second. "Salvatore," he rasped, his voice thick with a heavy Italian accent. "Sal. It's nice to meet you, Sal. Do you have anywhere to go? A family I can call?" Sal's expression fractured into confusion again. He touched his temples, wincing. "He lives near Rittenhouse Square. But the streets, they changed. The buildings are too tall. I got on the wrong bus. Someone bumped into me. My wallet." He patted his empty pockets again, distress rolling off him in waves. Dementia, Clara thought, her heart sinking. Her own grandfather had suffered from Alzheimer's before he passed away, and she recognized the terrifying lucidity that slipped in and out of the fog. "It's okay, Sal. You're safe here," Clara reassured him. "Eat your soup. I'll go to the back office and call the non-emergency police line. They can help find your son's address in Rittenhouse." Sal offered a weak, grateful smile, his hand reaching across the table to briefly pat hers. "Angelo," he whispered. Clara smiled back and stood up, making her way to the back office. She dialed the local precinct, waiting on hold for nearly 10 minutes, while a dispatcher took her details. When she finally emerged from the office, ready to tell Sal that an officer was coming to help him, she stopped dead in her tracks. Booth 4 was empty. The bowl of soup was finished, the rolls were gone, but Sal was nowhere to be seen. Clara rushed to the table, looking around the diner, but the heavy glass door was already shut. He had slipped back into the rainy night. "Damn it," she muttered, rushing to the window to peer out into the darkness. But the street was desolate. Defeated, she walked back to the booth to clear the dishes. As she picked up the empty coffee mug, she noticed something sitting on the folded paper napkin Sal had left behind. It wasn't money. It was a heavy, tarnished silver coin, an old Italian lira. Sitting right next to it was a solid gold Zippo lighter. Clara picked up the lighter. It was surprisingly heavy, cold against her palm. Engraved deeply into the gold was an intricate crest, a roaring lion clutching a rose in its jaws, surrounded by a halo of thorns. She shoved the items into her apron pocket, deciding she would hand them over to the police when they arrived. But the police never came that night. The dispatcher later told her over the phone that a shift change and a multi-car pileup on I-95 had diverted all available units. Clara walked home at 6 a.m., the heavy gold lighter resting in her pocket like a lead weight, entirely unaware that the crest engraved upon it belonged to the most feared organized crime syndicate on the East Coast. 48 hours later, the rain had cleared, leaving Philadelphia wrapped in a biting, dry chill. Clara was back at the South Street Diner for another grueling graveyard shift. Her life, for the most part, was an exercise in survival. Her landlord, a faceless entity operating under the umbrella of Apex Property Management, had taped a 3-day pay or quit notice to her apartment door that afternoon. She was short $400 for rent. Desperation had driven her to do something foolish earlier that day. Before her shift, she had walked down to a dimly lit pawn shop on Passyunk Avenue, intending to get the gold Zippo appraised. If it was real gold, it could cover her rent. The memory of the pawnbroker's reaction still made Clara's stomach turn. The moment the old man behind the plexiglass had taken a jeweler's loop to the crest, the lion and the rose, all the color drained from his face. He shoved the lighter back under the glass slot as if it were radioactive. "Take it. Take it and get out," the pawnbroker had hissed, his eyes darting toward his security cameras. "I just want to know what it's worth," Clara had pleaded. "It's worth a bullet to the back of the head. That's what it's worth," the man snapped. "I don't want no cartel, no mob heat in my shop. If you know what's good for you, throw that thing in the Delaware River." Now, at 11:30 p.m., Clara stood behind the diner counter, the lighter burning a metaphorical hole in her pocket. She couldn't focus. She kept dropping silverware and mixing up orders. The diner was relatively busy for a Thursday. Several booths were occupied by construction workers off a late shift and medical residents from Jefferson University Hospital. The clatter of plates and low murmur of conversation provided a comforting white noise until the noise stopped. It didn't taper off. It ceased abruptly, as if someone had pulled a plug on the room's audio. Clara looked up from the coffee machine. Outside the large glass windows, 3 black Cadillac Escalades with heavily tinted windows had pulled up directly to the curb, illegally parking across the bus lane. The engines idled smoothly, emitting low, aggressive rumbles. The doors opened in unison. 6 men stepped out. They didn't look like the usual South Philly tough guys in Carhartt jackets and Timberlands. These men wore tailored, charcoal Brioni suits. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. 4 of the men entered the diner. The bell above the door didn't chime cheerfully. It seemed to shriek. One of the men immediately turned and flipped the open sign to closed, sliding the heavy deadbolt into place with a definitive click. Another stood by the entrance, crossing his arms, his jacket parting just enough to reveal the unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster. Gary, the manager, emerged from the back office, his face turning the color of old oatmeal. "Private event," he stammered to the remaining customers, his voice cracking. The patrons didn't need to be told twice. The medical residents and construction workers quietly left cash on their tables and hurried out the back exit into the alley, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Clara stood frozen behind the counter. She felt a cold sweat prickle at the base of her neck. Then, the diner doors opened one last time. The man who walked in commanded the room without saying a word. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", with broad shoulders that filled out a midnight blue bespoke suit. His hair was dark, peppered with a few strands of silver at the temples, combed back immaculately. His jawline looked sharp enough to cut glass, but it was his eyes that were truly paralyzing. They were dark, endless voids, scanning the room with a cold, calculating detachment. A Patek Philippe Nautilus caught the harsh diner light as he adjusted his cuffs. This was Dominic Moretti, the undisputed head of the Moretti crime family. Dominic didn't look at Gary. He walked straight past the trembling manager and approached the counter. His Italian leather shoes made slow, deliberate sounds against the cheap linoleum floor. He stopped directly in front of Clara. The scent of him, expensive cedar cologne, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of ozone, overwhelmed the smell of the diner's fryers. "Tuesday night," Dominic said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a tremor straight down Clara's spine. It wasn't a question. Clara swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. Dominic motioned with his hand. One of the suited men stepped forward and placed an iPad on the counter. He tapped the screen. The video was grainy, shot from a high angle. It was the diner's own security footage that Gary swore was encrypted on a local server. The video showed Clara seating an old man at booth 4, bringing him soup, and sitting with him. "My father wandered away from his estate in Rittenhouse," Dominic said, his gaze fixed on Clara. "His security detail lost him. He suffers from advanced vascular dementia. For 2 days, my men have been tearing this city apart brick by brick looking for him. We found him 4 hours ago, wandering near the Navy Yard." Dominic leaned in closer. "When we got him to the private doctor, he kept talking about an angel in a diner, and he was missing something." Dominic reached into his jacket pocket. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "My father," Dominic continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously soft, "carries a very specific lighter, a family heirloom. It was missing from his coat. The street rats around here would have gutted him for the watch on his wrist, but he still had that." He stared into Clara's eyes, looking for a lie. "Did you rob an old, confused man after feeding him a bowl of soup?" "No!" Clara blurted out, the injustice of the accusation momentarily overriding her sheer terror. "No, I didn't steal anything. He left before the police arrived. I was trying to get him help. He left it on the table." She reached her shaking hand into her apron pocket. The suited men behind Dominic instantly shifted, hands drifting toward their lapels. Dominic raised a single finger, and they froze. Clara slowly pulled out the heavy gold Zippo and the silver lira coin, placing them gently on the Formica counter. Dominic looked at the items, then back at Clara. The hard, murderous edge in his eyes flickered, replaced by a profound, calculating scrutiny. He picked up the lighter, his thumb tracing the engraved lion, and rose. "You paid for his meal," Dominic stated, looking at the security footage again, noting the timestamp where she handed Gary money from her own pocket. "He was starving," Clara whispered, her knees shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. A heavy silence stretched through the diner. The hum of the refrigerators seemed deafening. Dominic pocketed the lighter and the coin. He looked at Clara, not as a threat anymore, but as an anomaly. In his world, kindness was a transaction, always carrying a hidden motive. "What is your name?" he asked softly. "Clara." "Clara Hastings." Dominic nodded slowly. "Clara Hastings. You didn't steal from Salvatore Moretti. You saved his life. And in my family, a debt of blood is paid in full, whether you want it to be or not." He turned on his heel, signaling his men. As they marched toward the door, Dominic stopped and looked over his shoulder. "Don't worry about the rent for your apartment, Clara. It's been handled." Along with the building, before Clara could ask what he meant, the men filed out. The Escalades roared to life, disappearing into the Philadelphia night, leaving Clara standing alone in a diner that suddenly felt like the center of a very dangerous universe. The morning after Dominic Moretti walked into the South Street diner, Clara awoke to a profound, unsettling silence. The constant, anxiety-inducing hum of her failing refrigerator had stopped. She groggily walked into her cramped kitchen in her South Philly apartment, only to find a brand new, stainless steel whirlpool humming quietly in its place. Sitting perfectly centered on her scuffed kitchen island was a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing her name in sharp, elegant calligraphy. Clara's hands shook as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock and a set of keys. Miss Hastings. Apex Property Management has been dissolved. The building at 1428 Passjunk is now under the permanent ownership of Moretti Holdings. A car will arrive for you at 2 p.m. D. Clara stared at the paper, the breath knocked out of her lungs. She rushed to her front door, yanking it open. The bright pink pay or quit eviction notice that had been taped there for 3 days was gone. In its place, the hallway smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner, and the broken light fixture overhead had been replaced. Panic, hot and suffocating, rose in her chest. She threw on her jeans and a faded Temple University hoodie, intending to march down to the police station to figure out how to undo this. But as she stepped out onto the stoop at exactly 1:55 p.m., a jet-black Lincoln Navigator smoothly glided to a halt against the curb. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He was built like a heavyweight boxer, wearing a sharply tailored grey suit that failed to hide the bulk of his muscles. He offered a polite, surprisingly gentle nod. "Miss Hastings." "I'm Vincent. Mr. Moretti sent me to collect you. I'm not going anywhere," Clara said, crossing her arms, trying to project a bravery she didn't feel. "You can tell Mr. Moretti I appreciate the refrigerator, but I can't accept it. Or the apartment. I pay my own way." Vincent didn't flinch. "Salvatore's asking for you, ma'am." "He keeps asking for the angel who gave him soup." The mention of the frail, bewildered old man pierced straight through Clara's defensive armor. She remembered the terrified look in Sal's eyes as the rain had battered his thin frame. Letting out a defeated sigh, she climbed into the back of the SUV. The drive to Rittenhouse Square was swift. The Navigator pulled up to a massive, ivy-covered brownstone on Delancey Place, arguably the most exclusive and heavily guarded street in Philadelphia. 2 men in dark suits stood casually near the wrought iron gates, their eyes scanning the street with professional paranoia. Vincent led her through the grand foyer, where the floors were laid with imported Carrara marble, and the air smelled of lemon oil and fresh lilies. He guided her into a sunlit conservatory at the back of the estate. Sitting in a plush velvet armchair, wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket, was Salvatore. He looked smaller than he had in the diner, frail and exhausted, staring blankly at a muted television screen. "Sal?" Clara said softly, stepping into the room. The old man turned. For a terrifying second, his pale eyes were empty, devoid of recognition. Then a spark ignited. His weathered face broke into a radiant, trembling smile. "Angel!" he rasped, reaching out a shaking hand. Clara rushed to his side, taking his cold hands in hers. "Hi, Sal. I heard you weren't eating. You have to keep your strength up. The soup here. It tastes like water," Sal grumbled, waving a dismissive hand toward a pristine silver tray holding a bowl of untouched minestrone. "Nothing like the diner. Nothing like the soup you gave me. I'll teach your chef how to make it with extra sodium," Clara joked gently, sitting on the edge of the ottoman. For the next 30 minutes, she sat with him, coaxing him to eat a few spoonfuls of broth and listening to fragmented stories about his childhood in Sicily. She didn't notice the tall, imposing figure standing in the doorway until Sal drifted off to sleep. Dominic Moretti stood there, completely motionless. In the daylight, without the diner's harsh fluorescent glare, he looked even more intimidating. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing a labyrinth of dark, intricate tattoos snaking up his left forearm. "He hasn't smiled like that in 6 months, Dominic said, his baritone voice a low rumble. She followed him down a hallway lined with museum-quality oil paintings and into a massive mahogany-paneled study. Dominic walked behind a massive desk and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He offered it to her. She shook her head. He drank it neat. "I called Temple University this morning," Dominic stated casually, leaning against the edge of his desk. "Your nursing program tuition was flagged for non-payment. You were 48 hours away from being dropped from your clinical rotations at Penn Presbyterian." Clara's jaw dropped. "How do you know that?" "I know everything about the people who intersect with my family," Dominic replied coldly. "Your balance was $22,000. It has been cleared. The bursar's office will mail your zeroed-out statement on Monday." "No," Clara said, her voice rising in panic. "No, you can't do that. I have student loans pending. I just needed a deferment. I didn't ask for your money, Dominic. I bought your father a bowl of soup because he was a human being freezing to death, not because I was looking for a Mafia payout." Dominic's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He set his glass down with a sharp clack. "Do not insult me by calling it a payout," he warned, his voice dangerously soft. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Stopping just inches from her, Clara had to tilt her head up to meet his dark, unreadable gaze. "In my world, Clara, kindness is a myth. People act out of fear or greed. You acted out of pure grace. You saved my father's life. If he had been out in that rain for another hour, his heart would have failed. I owe you a debt that $22,000 barely scratches. I don't want to owe you," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You don't owe me," Dominic corrected, reaching out. For a brief second, his knuckles grazed the side of her cheek, a touch so light it felt like a ghost, yet it sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. "I owe you, and the Moretti family never leaves a ledger unbalanced. Focus on your nursing school. Keep your apartment. Let me carry the weight." He stepped back, the fleeting moment of vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of cold authority. "Vincent will drive you home. Do not walk to the diner at night anymore. It isn't safe." Clara left the estate feeling entirely off balance. She had thought she was saving a helpless old man. Instead, she had anchored herself to the most dangerous predator in the city. A week passed. Clara tried desperately to sink back into the rhythm of her old life, ignoring the luxury refrigerator in her kitchen and the zero-balance receipt that arrived from Temple University. She convinced herself that Dominic had paid his perceived debt and moved on. The mob boss had bigger things to worry about than a broke nursing student. She was wrong. She just couldn't see the invisible net that had been cast over her. It was a blistering Tuesday night. Clara had insisted on working her final 2 weeks at the South Street Diner to leave on good terms, despite Dominic's indirect warning. The graveyard shift was dead, the rain coming down in sheets just like the night she met Salvatore. At 3 a.m., Gary told her to take the heavy trash bags out to the alley dumpster. Clara pushed through the heavy metal back door, the smell of rotting onions and damp cardboard hitting her immediately. She dragged the heavy black plastic bags toward the rusted green dumpster, shivering in the biting wind. She never heard the footsteps over the sound of the rain. A heavy, leather-clad hand clamped brutally over her mouth, while a thick arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. Clara screamed against the glove, thrashing violently, kicking her worn Reeboks backward into her attacker's shins. "Hold her still, you idiot!" a harsh, raspy voice hissed. A second man stepped out from behind the dumpster. He was drenched, holding a suppressed Glock 19. Well, Dominic's little charity project. Carmine is going to love this. The boss pays a girl's tuition, buys her building. He must be real sweet on you, sweetheart. You're our new leverage. Clara's blood ran cold. Carmine. She had heard the whispers in South Philly. Carmine Rossi was the head of a brutal, rival faction, trying to usurp the Moretti family's control over the docks. They didn't know she was just a waitress who helped an old man. They thought she was Dominic's secret mistress. The man holding her began dragging her toward an unmarked black van idling at the mouth of the alley. Clara bit down as hard as she could on the leather glove. The man cursed, his grip loosening just enough for her to scream, "Help!" Before the second man could raise his gun to silence her, a shadow dropped from the fire escape above them. It was Arthur, one of the suited men Clara had seen at the Rittenhouse estate. He had been quietly shadowing her every move for the past week. Arthur landed with a heavy thud, instantly driving a combat knife into the shoulder of the man holding the gun. The alley erupted into chaos. The suppressed pistol coughed thwip, thwip, and Arthur let out a sharp grunt, staggering backward as a bullet grazed his thigh. The man holding Clara panicked, shoving her violently against the brick wall. Clara hit her head hard, her vision swimming in dark spots. As she slid to the wet pavement, the deafening roar of a V8 engine shattered the night. A black Escalade didn't just pull up to the alley. It rammed straight into the side of the Rossi van, crushing the driver's side door inward with a horrifying crunch of metal and glass. The doors flew open. Dominic Moretti stepped out into the pouring rain. He didn't look like the restrained, wealthy businessman from the study. He looked like the devil incarnate. In a blur of motion, he drew a Sig Sauer P-226 and fired 2 perfectly placed shots. The Rossi goon holding the gun dropped instantly, a bloom of crimson spreading across his chest. The second man, the one who had grabbed Clara, froze, dropping to his knees and raising his hands in sheer terror. "Dominic, wait." It was Carmine's order. Dominic didn't say a word. He walked up to the kneeling man and struck him across the temple with the heavy steel grip of his pistol. The man collapsed, unconscious before he hit the asphalt. Clara sat against the brick wall, gasping for air, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. Arthur was leaning against the dumpster, applying pressure to his bleeding leg. "Arthur, sit down!" Clara yelled, her nursing instincts abruptly cutting through her shock. She scrambled over to him, ripping off her diner apron. "Keep pressure on it. It's a through and through." It missed the femoral artery, but you're losing blood fast. She quickly tied the thick canvas strings of the apron around his upper thigh, securing a makeshift tourniquet. Dominic watched her, his chest heaving under his wet suit jacket, the gun still hanging loosely in his grip. The cold, murderous fury in his eyes slowly receded as he looked at her kneeling in the muck, her hands covered in his bodyguard's blood, entirely selfless even after nearly being abducted. He holstered his weapon and crouched down in front of her. He gently grabbed her wrists, pulling her hands away from Arthur. "My men will handle him, Clara," Dominic said, his voice surprisingly soft over the sound of the rain. "Vincent is calling the private clinic now." Two more heavily armed men poured out of the escalade, immediately lifting Arthur and dragging the unconscious Rossi goons out of sight. Dominic looked at Clara's face. There was a dark bruise already forming on her cheekbone where she had hit the brick wall. He reached out, his thumb gently grazing the swollen skin. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. "They thought I was your girlfriend," Clara stammered, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "They said I was leverage. They made a fatal mistake," Dominic replied, his voice laced with a terrifying promise of violence. Carmine Rossi just signed his own death warrant. He took off his custom suit jacket and wrapped it around Clara's shivering shoulders. It swallowed her frame, smelling of gunpowder, cedar, and rain. "I can't stay here," Clara whispered, looking at the blood pooling in the alleyway. "You don't have a home in South Philly anymore," Dominic said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stood up, pulling her to her feet with him. "Rossi knows who you are. He knows where you live. If I leave you out of my sight, you're dead." Clara looked up at him, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She hadn't just dipped a toe into the underworld. She had been dragged to the bottom of the ocean. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small, the fight draining out of her. Dominic opened the heavy door of the escalade, shielding her from the rain. He looked down at her, his dark eyes intense and uncompromising. "You're coming with me. From this second forward, you are under my absolute protection. No one touches you. No one." As the door slammed shut, sealing her in the quiet, leather-scented darkness of the SUV, Clara realized that the life of a broke nursing student was gone forever. She was now tethered to the king of Philadelphia's underworld, a man whose hands were stained with blood, yet who looked at her as if she were the only thing worth saving. For 4 weeks, the Rittenhouse Square brownstone became Clara's gilded fortress. She didn't return to the South Street diner. Her Temple University lectures were live-streamed to a secure MacBook Pro on the estate's 3rd floor, and her clinical hours were temporarily suspended under the guise of a family emergency, a bureaucratic miracle orchestrated by Dominic's deep pockets. Life inside the Moretti compound was a study in jarring contrasts. In the mornings, she was simply Clara, a nursing student checking Salvatore's blood pressure and arguing playfully with the private chef about the sodium content of the marinara sauce. But at night, the heavy mahogany doors of Dominic's study remained closed, muffling the hushed, violent logistics of a mob war. The Rossi faction was bleeding the Morettis on the docks, desperate to avenge the men Dominic had crippled in the alleyway. The breaking point arrived on a frigid Thursday morning. Salvatore's chest pains, usually a dull ache, flared into a full-blown crisis. The private estate doctor, a nervous man named Dr. Aris, took one look at the portable EKG and turned pale. "It's an acute myocardial infarction," Dr. Aris stammered, packing his medical bag frantically. "We can't treat this here. He needs the cardiac catheterization lab at Penn Presbyterian immediately. If we wait for a discreet ambulance, he won't make it." Dominic's jaw tightened into a rigid line of granite. "Vincent, prep the armored motorcade. 3 vehicles. We leave in 2 minutes." Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the emergency medical jump bag and climbed into the back of the reinforced Cadillac Escalade, wedging herself next to the gasping Salvatore. Dominic slid in beside her, his suit jacket already cast aside, a matte black Heckler and Koch MP5 resting ominously across his knees. The motorcade tore through the streets of Philadelphia, sirens blaring from hidden grills, weaving aggressively toward the Schuylkill Expressway. Clara kept her fingers pressed firmly against Sal's wrist, counting his erratic, thready pulse. "Stay with me, Sal," she urged, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Keep your eyes on me, Angel," Sal wheezed, his skin an ashen grey. They were 2 miles from Penn Presbyterian Medical Center when the trap was sprung. A massive, commercial dump truck suddenly jackknifed across all 3 westbound lanes of the expressway. A deliberate, screeching blockade of twisted metal. Vincent slammed on the brakes, the heavy armored Escalade violently fishtailing before grinding to a halt inches from the concrete barrier. "Ambush! Weapons free!" Vincent roared over the comm system. Before the echo of his shout faded, the windows of the Escalade were peppered with heavy caliber gunfire. The ballistic glass spider-webbed but held firm against the barrage. Outside, men in tactical gear poured out of unmarked vans behind the blockade. At the center of the chaos stood Carmine Rossi, his face contorted in a sneer, wielding a heavy assault rifle. "He's using armor-piercing rounds," Dominic stated, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The glass won't hold for another minute." "Vincent, cover the left flank." Dominic looked at Clara, his dark eyes entirely stripped of their usual cold reserve. "Keep his heart beating, Clara. I will handle the rest." Dominic kicked his door open, rolling onto the asphalt into a hail of bullets. The deafening roar of automatic weapons consumed the highway. Clara ducked, shielding Salvatore's fragile body with her own. Suddenly, the heart monitor attached to Sal's chest emitted a flat, continuous tone. "No, no, no," Clara chanted. She ripped open his silk shirt, exposing his chest. Ignoring the bullets shattering the last layers of the bulletproof glass above her head, she locked her hands together and began CPR. 1, 2, 3, 4. Outside, Dominic moved with the ruthless precision of an apex predator. He flanked the Rossi men, his MP5 barking in short, controlled bursts. Carmine Rossi, realizing his forces were being decimated by a single, terrifyingly efficient man, turned to run. Dominic didn't give him the chance. A single, echoing shot from Dominic's sidearm caught Carmine in the back of the knee, sending him sprawling to the pavement. A second shot to the chest ended the Rossi reign permanently. The gunfire ceased, replaced by the eerie wail of approaching police sirens in the distance. Dominic wrenched the shattered door of the Escalade open, his face smeared with grease and blood. He froze. Clara was leaning over his father, sweat dripping from her forehead, delivering a shock from the portable AED. Then the monitor beeped. A jagged, steady rhythm appeared on the screen. Sal gasped, his eyes fluttering open. Clara collapsed back against the leather seat, gasping for air, her hands trembling violently. Dominic dropped his weapon. He pulled Clara into his chest, burying his face in her hair. It wasn't a calculated move. It was a surrender. "You saved him again," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking, a sound no one in the underworld had ever heard. Clara wrapped her arms around his blood-stained shirt, finally letting the tears fall. She looked out at the carnage on the Schuylkill, then up at the man holding her. The terrified nursing student was gone. In her place was a woman who had walked through the fire of the Mafia and forged herself into steel. Clara's simple act of kindness bridged 2 entirely different worlds, pulling her from the struggle of poverty into the fierce, gilded cage of the Moretti family. By saving Salvatore, she unknowingly won the unyielding loyalty of Dominic, a man who answered compassion with overwhelming protection. Sometimes, the smallest gestures don't just change a life, they rewrite your entire destiny, proving that true power bows only to genuine humanity.